The chateau into which my valet had ventured to make forcible entrance, rather than permit me, in my desperately wounded condition, to pass a night in the open air, was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which have so long frowned among the mountains, not less, in fact, than in the fancy of Mrs. Radcliffe. To all it had the appearance of being temporarily and very lately abandoned. We established ourselves in one of the smallest and least sumptuously furnished apartments, in a remote turret of the building. Its decorations were rich, yet tattered and antique. Its walls were hung with tapestry and bedecked with hunting trophies, together with an unusually great number of very spirited modern paintings in frames of rich golden arabesque. In these paintings, which not only hung from the walls in their main surfaces, but also in many nooks buried in the bizarre architecture of the chateau, I took deep interest, so that I bade Pedro to close the heavy shutters of the room, since it was already night, to light the tongues of the tall candelabra which stood by the head of my bed, and to throw open far and wide the fringed curtains of black velvet, which enveloped the bed itself. I wished all this done, that I might resign myself, if not to sleep, then at least to the contemplation of these pictures, along with the perusal of a small book which had been left upon the mattress, filled with descriptions and criticisms of them. Long, long I read, and devoutly, devotedly I gazed. Rapidly and gloriously the hours flew by, and the deep midnight came. The position of the candelabra displeased me, and rather than disturb my slumbering valet, I extended my hand with difficulty and placed it so as to throw its light more fully upon the book. But the action altogether produced an unanticipated effect. The rays of the numerous candles now fell within a niche of the room which had previously been hidden in the deep shade by one of the bedposts. I now saw in vivid light a picture that had gone unnoticed before. It was the portrait of a young girl, just ripening into womanhood. I glanced at the painting hurriedly, and then closed my eyes. Why I did this was not at first apparent, even to my own perception. But while my lids remained shut, I ran over in my mind the reason for shutting them. It was an impulsive movement to make sure that my vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and certain gaze. In a very few moments, I again looked fixedly at the painting. What I now saw, I could not and would not doubt, for the flashing of the candles upon that canvas had seemed to dissipate the dreamy stupor which was stealing over my senses, and startled me awake at once. The young girl's portrait was done in what is technically termed a vignette manner, a mere head and shoulders. The arms, the bosom, and even the ends of her radiant hair melted, imperceptibly, into a vague and deep shadow which formed the background of the piece. The frame was oval, richly gilded and ornamented with vines. As a thing of art, nothing could be more admirable than the painting itself. But it was not the portrait's immortal beauty, nor the execution of the work, which had so suddenly moved me. Nor had I mistaken the head for that of a living person, for the peculiarities of the design and the vignetting and the frame instantly dispelled the idea from even momentary entertainment. Thinking earnestly upon these points, I remained for an hour perhaps, half sitting, half reclining, with my vision riveted upon the portrait. At length, satisfied with the secret of its effect, I fell back within the bed. I had found the spell of the picture in an absolute lifelikeness of expression, which, at first startling, finally confounded, subdued, and appalled me. With deep and reverent awe, I replaced the candelabra in its former position. The cause of my deep agitation being thus shut from view, I sought eagerly the book which discussed the paintings and their histories. Turning to the number which designated the oval portrait, I there read the vague and quaint words which follow. She was a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. And evil was the hour when she saw and loved and wedded the painter. He, passionate, studious, austere, and having already a bride in his art. She all light and smiles, and frolicsome as the young fawn, loving and cherishing all things, hating only the art, which was her rival, dreading only the palette and brushes and other instruments, which deprived her of the gaze of her lover. It was thus a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even his young bride. But she was humble and obedient, and sat meekly for many weeks in the dark, high turret chamber, where the light dripped upon the pale canvas only from overhead. The painter took glory in his work, which went on from hour to hour and from day to day. He was a passionate, wild, and moody man who became lost in his mind, so that he would not see that light which fell so ghastly in that lone turret, withered the health and the spirits of his bride, who pined visibly to all but him. Yet still she smiled, on and on, uncomplainingly, because she saw that the painter, who had high renown, took a fervid and burning pleasure in his task, and wrought day and night to depict her who so loved him, yet who grew daily more dispirited and weak. But at length, as the labor drew nearer to its conclusion, the painter had grown wild with the passion of his work, and rarely turned his eyes away from the canvas, even to regard the countenance of his wife. And he would not see that the tints which he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him. And when many weeks had passed, and little remained to do save one brush upon the mouth and one tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady again flickered up as the flames of the candelabra. And then the brush was given, and then the tint was placed, and, for one moment, the painter stood in trance before the work which he had wrought, crying with a loud voice, "This is indeed life itself." He turned suddenly to regard his beloved, and grew pallid and aghast. She was dead. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No sickness had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its manifestation and its avatar, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding from the pores, the scarlet stains upon the body, and especially the face of the victim, which shut him out from aid and sympathy from his fellow men. And worst of all, the whole seizure, progression, and termination of the disease happened within just half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless, and clever. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned 1,000 friends, and with them retired to the deep seclusion of one of his towers, girdled in by a strong and lofty wall and gates of iron. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, the prince provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons and actors, ballet dancers and musicians. They played cards and drank wine, and there were beautiful women. Inside, there was safety and comfort. Outside lurked the Red Death. It was towards the 6th month of seclusion, and while the virus raged furiously abroad, the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed the embellishments of the 7 chambers, and there was much glare and glitter. The rooms held much beauty and extravagance, much oddness and terror, and even things that could make one feel disgusted. The apartments were so irregularly disposed, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre, that there was a sharp turn every 20 or 30 yards. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a private corridor which rounded the suite. These windows were of colorful stained glass, and the chambers changed to match their hues. The eastern extremity was vividly blue. The second chamber was purple in panes along with its ornaments and tapestries. The third was green throughout, and the fourth was orange, the fifth white, the sixth violet. The seventh apartment was shrouded in black velvet that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But, in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decor. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. There were no lamps or candles within any of the 7 apartments, but in the corridors, opposite to each window, there was a heavy torch that glaringly illuminated the room. But in the black chamber, the light that streamed upon the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon those who entered that there were few bold enough to set foot within it at all. It was in this apartment, also, that there stood a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when its minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came forth from the lungs of the clock a sound so clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note that, at each hour, the musicians in the orchestra would pause their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the dancers ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole company, and while the chimes of the clock yet rang, the giddiest grew pale. But when the echoes had ceased, laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled, and then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, there came another chiming of the clock, and then were the same as before. Throughout the 7 chambers, the partygoers moved, shifting and contorting, taking on the colors of the rooms. Then strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of velvet, and momently all is still, until the echoes die away, and again the music swells. But none of the maskers would venture through the room with blood-colored panes and black drapery. The other apartments were densely crowded, and the revel went whirlingly on, until at length the clock sounded, and then the music ceased, and the waltzers ceased their revolutions. Now there were 12 strokes to be sounded, and before the last echoes of the last chime had sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had become aware of the presence of a masked figure, not previously seen. And the whispers of this new presence arose at length from the whole company, a murmur, first of surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, and disgust. The figure was tall and gaunt and shrouded from head to foot. The mask most perfectly resembled the face of a stiffened corpse. His clothes were dabbled in blood, and his broad mask was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image that stalked among the waltzers, he was seen to shudder, either of terror or distaste, before his brow reddened with rage, and the music became hushed at the waving of his hand. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of the group around him in the blue chamber. "Who dares thus to make mockery of our woes? Unmask this scoundrel, so that we may know who it is that will hang at sunrise from the battlements. Will no one obey my command? Stop him and strip him of those stained robes of sacrilege." These words rang throughout the 7 rooms, loudly and clearly. At first, as he spoke, there was some movement in the direction of the intruder, who now made closer approach to the prince. But none put forth a hand to seize him, so that he passed within a yard of the prince and made his way uninterruptedly through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, along to the white, and even thence to the violet. It was then, however, that Prince Prospero rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers with a drawn dagger, and when the intruder left the velvet apartment, there was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped, gleaming, on the carpet, upon which fell instantly in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a crowd of the revelers seized the tall figure who stood erect and motionless in the shadow of the ebony clock, and gasped in unutterable horror at finding the corpse-like mask did not cover any tangible form. The Red Death had come in like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-sprinkled halls and died. And the ebony clock went out with the last of them, and the flames of the torches expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held dominion over all.